Hi, and welcome to Centering African, Latin American, and Indigenous History.
I'm Alicia Morris.
I'm Lucy Dawson, and I teach language arts and world history at Carey Academy.
And I teach world history at Carey Academy. So we need to start with the rationale or purpose of why we're here together. When thinking about history curriculum in general and world history curriculum in our case, it tends to be Eurocentric. A couple years ago, I did a survey of the chapters in a standard world history textbook, and the Eurocentric curriculum blew any other out of the water. There really is a need to uncover suppressed histories and those that are under the radar for a lot of Western historians. As predominantly middle-class, white, female teachers see us, right? In particular, we have to take the extra steps to go out of our way, get out of our comfort zone to make sure that other histories are centered. So we need to close the gap between what we're teaching and what students' actual histories are, and make sure that we're not telling our own story all the time.
Which is a nice segue into positionality and the importance of recognizing not only our own positionality as teachers, but to get our students to think through their own positionality and their identities, and how that affects and influences how they see history and the stories they've been told or have been exposed to. This is an example of some of the work we do with our students. This is called an identity wheel. And towards the beginning of the year, we have them fill out these spokes and identify their identities as it relates to religion and race and ethnicity and the language they speak at home, whether they're a sister or a brother, or hobbies and interests that they have.
And this leads into student reflections that take place. And again, and none of this happens in a vacuum. This work is essential to seeing where their perspective is, and we'll follow the topic of identity as we go throughout the year. So looking at these questions, it allows students to really think through, not necessarily they can think about their personal identity, but we kind of pool in as a class what identities might have come up that might be advantages in our own country from our own point of view, or challenges, right? And then following that with this, how might these advantages or challenges affect which stories are told, opens us up into thinking about what do we hear in society, what do we hear within our own minds as well.
Which connects with this wonderful TED Talk to Amanda Adichie, who is a Nigerian author, novelist, her danger of a single story, which we start off with in the beginning of the year, and it becomes a very central and important theme throughout our study of world history. The idea that when you just have one story of a whole people or a whole place, how dangerous that is, and how we have to intentionally and purposely reach out for more stories to fill out a richer and fuller view of a historical event or a place or a group of people.
So the first kind of way that we jump into thinking about the stories that we're told and exploring those a little bit is we have all of the students walk through, as it were, a kind of inventory of Western media coverage about the African continent. We start by looking at the stereotypes that students might already have, and while not explicitly asking them what stereotypes they have, because that actually reinforces stereotypes the more you talk about them, we actually present students with pictures of modern cities, restaurants, art galleries, people being people, all across the African continent and cities. And you can see these quotes from students, right? Is that LA or Miami? I think that's Pittsburgh. I don't know anything anymore, right? The kids have seen or heard things that weren't shown, right? Or were shown, sorry, too often, that they don't realize that other types of people and experiences are had across the African continent. So it's really an eye opener for them to see the modern across the African continent. And we also follow that up with what we call, do you want the good news or the bad news first? We have students actually review media coverage of the African continent, and while they're researching specific countries, right? And they could say news in Tanzania or news in Ghana. They're recording the headline, what the article is about, and if the article is generally positive. And you can see their pooled results here on this Mentimeter, and you can right up very close see the negative topics that are covered. These were by BBC, New York Times, CNN, so major outlets, but of course, Western, and thus we end up seeing this kind of news coverage, hence perpetrating this single story. So these are the things that we have to fight against with our curriculum.
So next we want to do a little reflection with you all and think about what stories are on your bookshelves. So we would love for you to take a moment. You can pause this video and take 5 minutes to look at your own bookshelf. What are the voices that are represented? What are the experiences that are represented? The places, the people, the authors, and the stories that you surround yourself with. And then we'll come back in 5 minutes. See you then. All right, welcome back. So we've just been talking about sort of the rationale for this kind of work, and also the importance of understanding our own positionalities and our own perspectives when doing this work. The next part of our presentation is really about best practices when diversifying your curriculum. Here's sort of an overview of a few that we are going to touch on in more depth, but being really mindful about language and terminology, celebrating and highlighting positive history, teaching resistance, revolution, revolt, debunking myths and stereotypes with imagery, which we already saw with when Alicia was talking about images of big cities throughout the African continent, and then finally decolonizing history.
So our first example of terminology use is specific to the African continent, right? And that is fundamentally making sure that you are using terminology that is appropriate and is more truthful, really, and using words like house instead of hut, right? Ethnic group, right, instead of tribe specifically. Cities or towns, communities, civilizations, kingdoms, right, instead of villages. Obviously using specific country names and not only the name of the continent, etc. This continues on when looking at other groups around the world, including Indigenous peoples. The study of Indigenous people, there actually isn't a definition for the word Indigenous. Why? Because so many different types of groups of people fit into that category. So when studying Indigenous peoples, make sure to label them appropriately using ethnic groups, cultural, people with cultural connections. In addition, making sure to label settler colonialism as settler colonialism, right? We look at the United States specifically as a settler society, right? A society created by European settlers and the impact that that has on Indigenous peoples and groups in the Americas. So really making sure to be very specific.
Another way to decolonize history is to read, right? Mm-hmm. And to expand and diversify the voices and the stories that we have at our disposal as teachers. So here's just a smattering of examples of reads that and books that might help you out there to do that.
This definitely helps decenter Western arguments and stories, and several of these have, you know, totally remade my viewpoint and vision of how I see the world. And I think that it can help any teacher of history see a new point of view.
Another best practice is we really like to give our students tons of choice to choose topics that relate to them personally. So for example, we do a deep dive into migration, both in language arts and history, and they get to study a historic migration. And so students have lots of choice there and can always choose a group that resembles them and is connected to their own history. So for example, Indian removal, or the Great Migration, or the Second Great Migration, or Haitian migration.
We've had multiple students who have actually had their own parents be members of these large-scale migration groups because of being refugees, and it really makes students feel excited sometimes to learn a lot about themselves and also their families.
Another great best practice is to use your own school community and reach out and connect with parents, with alums, with anybody within your wonderful school network. So we have a day where we celebrate African voices within our community. And here are some of our wonderful parents who come in to share their culture, food, dress, experiences. It's also a great way to celebrate positive history and to broaden our students' perspectives and to debunk myths.
Right. We've had two big celebrations like this, or at least kind of all day, or at least a lot of visitors coming into our classroom, getting very excited about what they're sharing. Obviously, the students love it, have a great time eating the food. Prior to COVID, we had communal Ethiopian meals together, and then after, we're still at least able to eat outside together. It's a really great way for us to draw together and hear stories from parents and students in our own community here at TA.
The third part is really getting to content and units of study. So there's lots of examples here that we welcome you to incorporate or consider as a part of your own curriculum.
So this is the meat, right? This is taking a look at our CA World History curriculum. So one of the best practices for decentering European perspectives, decolonizing history, is to start from scratch, right? Over the years, we have reworked, reorganized. Every year we learn more, right? Listen more to what needs to be covered and what's missing. So you can see here how the years divided up. We have a part one that literally is focused on these big themes like migration. We also study historical pandemics, but seeing us, right? Who we are, what is positionality, and then how do we, what do we hear from the world as well, right? What's the dominant narrative, and what do we need to raise up? The other parts of the year focus on two major parts of the world. The first is the African continent and the world, and the second is the Americas. So you can see here some of our major projects. We're going to touch on a few of these in the coming slides.
So the first part here will be a look at the African continent and some of the units of study we've come up with that look at that. First one here is Great African Civilization. So here students again get a lot of choice. That's actually on the next slide here, of different civilizations to focus on. And they do a deep research project, learning all about that civilization, and then create their own original artifact that celebrates an aspect of that civilization, and then also craft a persuasive argument that has a real audience, the NC Department of Public Instruction, to demand that the African continent and its civilizations be taught more and more broader, deeper coverage.
And you can see some of the pictures here, student original artwork celebrating griot of West Africa, Benin bronzes, a sculpted Nok head from the Nok civilization. So you can see how we have included many civilizations across the African continent, and making close attention to the fact that, right, Egypt is an African civilization, and it should be included in all of our early African civilizations research. including, right, North African civilizations and Morocco as well. Don't be afraid to include topics of study that you don't know anything about, right? We have to get uncomfortable. We have to take the time to learn more things, but we can learn along with our students. And so it doesn't make good sense to avoid something. If you don't know enough about it, you can learn as your students learn. So that allows us to really expand our topic choice, and students have a lot of fun with this project.
That's certainly something I learn from my students every year about all of these topics. Another topic we look at is the Atlantic slave trade, which is something we put a lot of time and thought into how to approach this, and making sure that we're creating a safe space for our students and creating discussion norms so that all of our students feel safe and comfortable during this project. We did want our students not just to learn the facts and the figures, but to feel about this difficult part of hard history. So they come up, they choose a piece of art that is connected to slavery in the Atlantic, and then write about how it demonstrates what they've learned so far.
And what you can see is we're kind of creating this sandwich. We always start the year with really positive and celebratory focus on the African continent histories. And then we move into this harder conversation, obviously a very difficult and challenging legacies of the Atlantic slave trade in America and Africa, which we make sure to really clarify and also delineate the differences between slavery in America and slavery that existed in Africa. And then we sandwich that at the end with a really fun exploration of some really exciting and groundbreaking leaders and events on the African continent as colonization ended, right? As countries became independent, and students actually use what they learn about independence movements in Ghana, Algeria, Kenya, and South Africa in particular, and leaders of those movements to write an original parable in which they
pick a metaphor, right?
Metaphorically show.
Right, show what happened, right? And again, as we said earlier, best practices about focusing on resistance, right, and empowerment. And so it allows them to think in those terms of how people fought back and gained independence and power.
And my brain freeze recovered. Here is a great example of some of the visual work that goes along with this. So while students create their own story, they also are responsible for creating a visual. And here you can see one that is the earth and the sun as our characters here. Just so that you all have this in full, this lesson, it actually is available online. So if you look on the Yale PEER, which is Programs and International Education Resources site, you can actually access a lesson that I wrote, which was this parable lesson. So I can also get that to you all as well. But it's a really fun and creative way to deepen their understanding of this independence movement, this era of independence. All right, move on to the Americas.
Yes, so from Africa to the Americas.
One thing that we've been doing over the past couple of years is figuring out how to better center Indigenous values. And one way that I found to do this is focus on the guiding principles that we already have at our school. Those are respect, integrity, and compassion. And so even though we're not thinking about history right now, these expectations are embedded in our syllabus. And so I have added to those the 7 guiding principles, which connect to Anishinaabe and Ojibwe people of North America. And as a result, we're embedding values of love and courage and wisdom, respect, truth, humility, and honesty into how we treat one another within our course and as we go through the entire year. So while it's not explicitly taught in terms of content yet, we embed these ideas from the get-go.
We start with a project on great American civilizations, and it's actually a curation, a museum exhibit, which really creates a lot of student engagement. But students, read, they choose a topic, and we have our topics listed right here of civilizations throughout the Americas, so in North America and South America, and do a deep research dive, and then choose and select artifacts to put on display. And you could do this as a physical display or a more virtual display, which we've done in recent COVID times. And it allows students to curate, right? To choose an experience, a visual and aesthetic experience, and choose things that are more text or that are sculptures in 3D or 2D paintings, or actual physical objects, which brings up really interesting discussions around museums, right? And the purpose of museums, that museums are not neutral.
And we kicked off this project last year by, I had a conference with a curator at the North Carolina Museum of Art, Angel Gonzalez, who helped guide us to really think about what the purpose of museums are and how museums themselves choose the messaging that they want to put out in the world. And so that allows the students to actually create the narrative, right, about these civilizations. Another thing to note, if you see our topic choices, what's really important is to make sure to name civilizations as they call themselves. Obviously, Maya is a connection, right, of city-states, right? But the reality is that what is called the Inca civilization was referred to as Suyu, etc. So just making sure that you are doing as best as you can to name civilizations appropriately, and again, and they'll begin to kind of take root with your students.
Another project that we do that, again, the students have really enjoyed and have gotten a lot of engagement through is looking at resistance and revolution in the Americas. So again, drawing on that positive history and empowering history. Not only do you look at colonization in the Americas, but we also, again, that sandwich effect, we end with voices of resistance and revolution. And students, again, research, they have a topic of their choice. They have, resistance movements of their choice. And then they show what they've learned through the art of public art, murals, which of course has wonderful close connections with Mexico. And so we had to get lots of chalk and out on concrete sidewalks, and students represented what they learned about important figures, about what people were fighting for, about how they sought to make change, all get represented in these beautiful, colorful murals.
And the messages, right, that they shared lives on to generations today and to contemporary society as well. It was a really fun project.
Yeah, it was.
So a couple of things to kind of further, follow up on teaching about the Americas is that teaching history of Native American people, there are some great places to start. This would go kind of harken back to the best practices, but we have a couple of sources here that are really fundamental, I think, in kind of getting you started. Indigenous North American history is often ignored in world history classes. People tend to think that, it belongs in the United States, right? But the reality is that these civilizations were thriving prior to settler arrival. And so it's really important to ingrain those into your course. So as you see, we have the topical choices during different projects, extends to our Native American people. Here are some awesome sources for finding content that's ready for you, as the National Museum of American Indian. Native Knowledge 360 has millions of lesson plans, it seems. You can't finish up with those. And then a couple of great educators guide and articles that you can see here as well.
So for our final activity, and before we sign off here, we would love for you to take 5 minutes to think a little bit about your own curriculum. List out the current units of study that you do, and notice the perspectives that are represented and maybe those that aren't represented. What voices are there and what voices maybe are missing. And how can you work from the ground up to reimagine your curriculum to better center more diverse voices in history? While you do that, please know that you can always reach out to us. We love to make new partnerships and to talk shop. I'm Lucy Dawson, Lucy_Dawson at careacademy.org.
I'm Alicia Morris at careacademy.org, and I hope that our presentation has given you a good overview of what we do in our own curriculum, and know that, this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we are happy to share with you all. If you're interested in incorporating any of these projects, we have everything, organized, information available for anyone who reaches out, and we really hope that we hear from some of you.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you. Y'all have a good afternoon. Bye. Bye.